So thanks very much for coming. My name's Martin. I'm a developer advocate at Zuplo. We're an API and AI and MCP management platform. And today I'm going to talk about some of the things that I think we need to start thinking about in terms of how we're going to change API monetization for this new era that we're entering, the era of AI. What's going to change during the next couple of years, or maybe even just the next couple of months? What's still going to work from previously, and what we need to do and start thinking about in order to get ready for this. But before we get to the future, I want to talk a little bit about the past. So I want to jump back to 2023. And during 2023, the Straits Research group released a report that valued the API economy at that time at $3.6 billion annually, with an estimate that it was going to rise to somewhere in the region of $25 billion by 2032, which was, at that time, around a 23% compound annual growth rate, was what they were saying. And this is basically saying, in 2023, the API economy was very much real, right? These are very big numbers. This is driven by, huge successes of companies like Stripe and Twilio, basically being API first and monetizing that extremely well, proving that billions of dollars could be made just through APIs, which of course was no news to anybody in 2023. But just as a jump forward, the 2025 numbers from Straits Research have also now been released, and the economy is now valued at $5.6 billion, rising to $33 billion in 2032. So that compound annual growth rate that they predicted at 23 is about 23.7 right now, so it's definitely tracking with where it's going, but it's probably about to go like this, because everything changed at that point in 2023, because AI really arrived and started to change everything. It didn't just continue the growth curve, it fundamentally altered how APIs are going to be consumed. AI agents entered into production, and suddenly APIs just weren't being called by humans who were clicking buttons anymore. They were being called by autonomous systems, and those were running 24/7, a very different type of consumer than had been previously seen. So the API economy is still growing, but the nature of that growth is completely changing. Previously, when we looked at how APIs were consumed, you had typical developers and predictable patterns. So people who were building against your APIs would go out and they would discover them. They would go look at the documentation. They would build some kind of proof of concept of what it is that they wanted to do, make a few hundred requests a day whilst doing that, then to say, okay, we want to put this into production. So they would go through the process of subscribing to whatever it is that you have to offer, or maybe they would get into some kind of contractual conversation with you that required people to actually have calls and discuss things. But they were coming to you with an idea of some kind of understandable volume of what it is that they were going to be doing, an idea of this is how much traffic we're going to be sending, how much are you going to charge us for this? And then you would assign an account manager potentially to that, and they would keep track of whether they were on track with what it is that they were using, what they were spending, whether they were below it, whether they were above it. Do they need to do some kind of a renegotiation? Lots of conversations between humans were taking place. But then there's an agentic consumer coming into the mix, and all of a sudden it's doing 50 times that amount of traffic. It's doing millions of requests. It's 24/7, 365. It doesn't wait for humans to pick up the phone, jump on a Zoom call, or have a conversation with you. It doesn't wait for legal to come back with the red lines on the contract. There are no humans in the loop, and the predictable kind of spiky nature of their traffic means that it's very difficult to think about how that is actually going to get monetized. They also require instant provisioning, so that time that it used to take to actually get to the point of putting something into production now needs to happen almost instantaneously. But it doesn't change the fact that APIs are how AI gets work done. You've heard that in probably almost every talk that you've been at during the course of this conference so far, and it's true, and that doesn't change in this instance either. The state of API's report from Postman that came out last week definitely does point to this. 89% of developers are using AI tooling. That AI tooling is probably also hitting APIs like even more increasingly as days that go by. 7.5 million calls to AI APIs over the course of the past year, a 40% year-on-year growth. That's just with Postman. When 65% of the organizations that they surveyed for that report generating revenue from APIs. Right now, they're generating revenue using these traditional models, right? Usage-based models. These are things that I'm sure you're all familiar with, and Adam called this out yesterday in his keynote talk as well. These models have been around for a very long time. You've got usage-based models, where maybe you do a call per request, or perhaps in this case a token, or perhaps a compute unit that costs a certain amount, and there is some kind of a rate limit on it. Then you've also got tiered pricing, which gives a little bit more of a predictable monthly cost. It's still one of the most common approaches for API companies today, right? A subscription model. You use this much for this much a month, and when it runs out, that's it. Next month you pay for the same amount of access. But that's starting to get a little bit tired at this point, which is why there's been a bit more of a shift now towards a hybrid model. And this has been adopted by many companies. In fact, we use this at Zuplo already, which is more of a hybrid model. And that's a base tier, so some kind of subscription, but understanding that you're going to have a level of overage in there that ultimately needs to get paid, but also means that you're not going to be cutting off access in any way, but you're still going to be ensuring that you're getting paid for what it is that's being used. And it's understandable and, to a degree, somewhat predictable. Basis of something like $100 a month, and then after that, you'll pay an addition for every request that you do after that point. Not in a percentage, though. That should be $1. Because we're at a point where we've got this new reality of agentic traffic coming through. And when you've got that coming through, all of a sudden, some of these old models, they start to fall apart. AI starts to break things. And one of those things is that cost explosions are very possible, right? This is what breaks with AI. You know, imagine a concept of this, like an agent runs overnight, you know, either it's just lost or it takes on a heavy workload that uses your API and it generates a $10,000 bill whilst doing that because there was nothing there that was actually going to cut it off. And all of a sudden you're getting emails from a customer like furious as to why they have to do that. But it is a reality without guardrails in place. Second of all is that traditional payments don't necessarily work in the agentic world either, because you know, AI agents, they don't really have browsers, they certainly don't really have any fingers, and they can't fill out payment forms, and they're not going to get into protracted conversations with your legal department about this point and that point not necessarily tracking with what they expected. And of course, the security threats come from this as well. 51% of developers now cite unauthorized AI agent access as one of their top security concerns. And agents can exploit even the smallest vulnerabilities, like the best hacker that you've ever come across, at machine speed, in a very persistent way, indefinitely, which can amplify things like credential breaches across systems to a point where it can become very expensive and ultimately very, very bad. The other reality is that there's just going to be an increase in overall traffic, right? Somewhere in the region of 50x at least. Traditional rate limits break agent workflows. If you're just going to cut off traffic after a particular point, and you're not going to include in responses that come back from that particular request as to how long you're supposed to wait until you make the next one, or what action should be taken, you're just going to end up with an agent consistently trying to hammer your API, whether or not it's making the request or not. Ultimately, it's just going to fail. And agents need what's called burst capacity. So maybe, perhaps it needs 10,000 requests in 10 seconds, and then nothing for an hour. But your rate limiting needs to adapt to understand this kind of pattern. I think real-time metering is something that has started to grow, particularly over the past couple of years. We've seen more companies that specialize in this particularly. There was one called OpenMeter that just did metering that was recently acquired by Kong, which I think was very much an indication of their expectations as to this kind of traffic being much more necessary and being able to monetize around that particular traffic being much more necessary. But I also don't think metering is optional anymore. You know, when an agent makes 1 million API calls in an hour, you can't wait until the end of the month to calculate that usage. Customers need to see this activity and this kind of cost building up over the course of right now, instantaneously, so that they can make decisions about whether or not to let that continue. Batch processing just isn't going to cut it anymore. And as we said, agents can't fill out payment forms. They don't have credit cards necessarily. They've got no browser. So when an agent needs to use your API at, say, 3 a.m. on any given day, there's no human awake to actually approve that. So how does it actually get the access that it needs? There's going to have to start to be a move towards programmatic payment flow, which is why protocols like ACP and AP2, which I'll talk about in a second, are going to start to become much more important. And also, leak keys and loose scopes can lead to kind of unlimited chaos, which can be costly not just for your customers, but also for you. And that's ultimately going to lead to an experience that is probably not going to be the best for either of you, leading to the fact that your customers potentially are just going to walk away if that bad experience happens to them. So, what can you do to start getting prepared for this? We'll talk a little bit about an action plan. And one of the things that I would say is that you can keep what already works. Usage-based pricing, tiered plans, hybrid models, these are fundamentals that I think are pretty solid. Stripe didn't change their pricing model for AI agents, they just changed how agents pay. The other thing is you start to adapt for agentic patterns by implementing spending caps, by implementing real-time alerts, so customers have some kind of cost control, and adding that real-time metering, because batch processing is not going to be able to keep up with the agentic volume that you're seeing. Being able to build in burst-aware limitations that are going to understand that agents need to have 10,000 calls in 10 seconds and not 100 calls per minute and then nothing. And then also think about some of the new capabilities. Start to enable agentic commerce, support for programmatic payments through protocols like ACP, so agents can actually transact without humans being in the mix. And also implementation of things like agent-specific authentication, so you know who's calling your API, and potentially you can price accordingly or differently to how you would do it for any other kind of traffic. And the other thing to think about here as well, and a lot of people have said this over the course of the past couple of days, and that is you want to be considering using some kind of an MCP server. So agents have a way of more appropriately discovering and understanding your API and the use cases that it can achieve. It's very likely that MCP and payments are going to be quite tightly wound over the next few months, couple of years, and actually having this as the main level of discoverability is going to be probably one of the best things that you can do to start to be prepared for how that transaction is going to be taking place at the agentic level, but also just inside the chat-based applications that people are using on the day-to-day basis, like ChatGPT or Claude. So when should you start with the implementation of this? Well, I think most people would say probably yesterday, but you don't necessarily need to go out and throw away everything that you've been working on and get to doing this right away. But there are some things that you can start working on right now, and I think these first 3 things speak to a little bit more of the customer experience side of things than the actual payment side of things, but I think they're important. So actually focusing on whether or not you can implement things like spending caps or different kinds of rate limiting right now, putting real-time usage alerts in there so people have got some idea of what is actually being spent and they know if something's going awry and they're going to get charged a big bill, putting some kind of percentage warnings in there over the course of any given month, some kind of cost projection also as to, based on your traffic patterns so far, potentially you could be looking at a bill of this much before the end of the month. Maybe you want to optimize some of the things that you're doing. That's all customer experience stuff that, again, people are just going to appreciate, especially in this time right now where they spend a lot of time experimenting. And experiments can be great, but they can also go very wrong. So what can you do to help any customers of your API ensure that they don't end up with bills that are unexpected, that ultimately makes them want to move away from using your system because you've not protected them in the way that they would hope. Later on, identifying agent traffic versus other traffic and being context aware around the rate limits that you have, and also considering caching, semantic caching, or caching of any kind, really, because that's the kind of thing that's going to help you to ensure that you do not have repeated traffic costing you as an API provider a lot of money because those requests are just going to be coming the same all the time. And if 10,000 of those requests are exactly the same, that's going to cost you a lot of money. You don't want that to happen. And then further down the line, 3 to 6 months, but maybe sooner, agentic payments and agent-specific provisioning and authentication, and also considerations of MCP. So this stuff, as soon as you can, potentially, and this stuff, start thinking about it right now. On the payment side, we're entering a new era of protocols, more protocol wars. Who will win? Who knows? But there are a few out there at the moment that are worth considering. One from Stripe, one that's led by Google, and another one that's being championed by Coinbase. Stripe's is already kind of live in ChatGPT. They developed it with OpenAI. Right now, I think it allows you to buy things from Etsy and only in North America, but it's going to expand beyond that to, I think, everything that you can possibly do with Shopify, which is a huge ecosystem. Google's is a little bit more focused on digital mandate, so kind of a little bit more of a contractual understanding between two different services that says, okay, you're allowed to do this, and this is how much money you might want to spend. And then Coinbase's, which is actually based off of an older HTTP protocol, HTTP 402, if anybody's aware of that, which is payment required. They've actually gone out and made that work, and it allows for microtransactions using USDC. Really interesting. I've got a link at the end for more information on all of this stuff. They're well worth digging into. But the biggest thing here is going to be, I don't necessarily think this is for API providers to go and do their own implementations of. This is whoever you do your payments with needs to be thinking about how much of these or which of these they're actually going to be implementing so that you can go ahead and use them. But ultimately, what we're seeing here is not necessarily a fundamental change in how APIs get monetized, but more of an evolution than a revolution. Because the traditional models, they do still work. You don't need to go out and rip everything that you have out there and start again. You're just adding to the infrastructure layer that makes your API monetization start to fit more with what agentic traffic is actually going to look like. So you can start with some of the things that I've already mentioned there and build up to some of the more futuristic stuff as time allows and as things start to level out in terms of what kind of payment processing is actually going to be taking place. Timeline-wise, we're probably here today. This is all going to be quite speculative because things move very, very quickly, but we're very much at a point where in the next 6 months, every mainstream API product will be integrating APIs programmatically, and MCP is going to be a huge driver of that. In 12 months, you'll see agent-first companies where the majority of their traffic is coming from autonomous systems, not human users. And in 24, but probably sooner, months, agents are probably going to be the majority of API traffic across the industry, which is something that we've heard from many people over the past couple of days. So, some key takeaways. Traditional pricing still is going to work for the time being. Implementation is the thing that needs to evolve. And programmatic payment is coming, but don't freak out about it just yet. We'll see how this pans out. Keep an eye on what's going on. If you're working with a payment processor, have a conversation with them at the moment about which ones they're looking at and which ones they might be implementing. Interesting question is going to be is, if you use Stripe for your monetization right now, they have their own protocol. But are they going to support what Google's offering as well? I don't know. But it's going to be an interesting conversation to have with them and see whether that is something that they're considering. And of course, you do want to consider acting now rather than later. This is going to happen whether you like it or not, and being prepared for it is definitely going to set you in the best stead. So remember, you're not replacing what already works. You are extending this for a new type of customer. I've got a whole bunch of resources and stuff that you can go read about this stuff because it is a rabbit hole that you probably might want to go down. It's certainly very interesting on that QR code or that link right there. And if you do want to dive into the world of using something like Zuplo to work with your API management or to build your MCP servers or to be your AI gateway, then you can discover us at that right there. And of course, if this piqued your interest in any way, do stick around for the third talk, which is from Tyler, which is going to build on some of the things that I've already talked about, I hope. Thank you very much.
Thank you.